Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone, at least remotely. As just discussed, my name is Craig Labovitz. I'm the CTO for Nokia Deepfield, and I'll be shifting gears a little bit today, not just speaking about Australia, but speaking about sort of a global view of the pandemic. And hopefully everyone can see the slides as I go through them. Please let me know if there's an issue. So just to provide a little bit of background about the data going into the talk today. Deepfield, although part of Nokia, a very large hardware vendor, we're actually a software startup that joined Nokia about 2017, providing real-time analytics from routers and switches and DNS and other core infrastructure from providers around the world, largely selling to very large telecom, transit providers, and very large content providers. The analysis today is based really on a partnership with more than 50 providers around the world, where we've been able to collect real-time streaming data from the core routers and analyze traffic. The data represents a fairly large cross-section of North America, about 70% we estimate of US traffic, maybe a third of all European traffic, and smaller percentage of Asia-Pac. Though we do have some Australia data, I did not have time to include it in the talk today. And while I won't go into all the background on the analysis, the methodology is similar to a number of papers we've done in years past, and you're certainly welcome to read those to get more analysis. So we've been looking at really the last year of data, and more specifically the last 4 weeks, to understand what is happening in the internet. Clearly, this is an unprecedented time in sort of global, at least certainly global recent history, and definitely in internet traffic. I've been studying internet traffic since the start of the internet, my first job back in the early 90s, and we have never seen growth like this in a matter of weeks. As we look at data around the world, in Europe and now in the US, we've seen basically 30 to 45% growth. In some cases, 30 to 60% growth just over the last couple of weeks. Now, as many attendees may know, that 30, 40, 50% growth is normally what we see in a year of the internet. So quite unusual and quite unexpected to see this in just 2 weeks. The big question we keep getting asked is, how is the network doing? Well, I think the good news is the network seems to be doing fairly well. The network seems to be meeting demand in most of Europe, US, and Asia, where we've seen consistent streaming rates where, unless otherwise degraded by policy via Netflix or YouTube or Zoom. We were concerned going back basically about 2 weeks as we saw 30 and 40% growth 2 weeks in a row. The obvious question was, would this growth continue? The network could just sustain a growth of 40% in a short time period, but not 40, 50% week over week. Largely, we appear to have reached what's I've been calling peak internet, which really is Saturday or Sunday night, where we seem to have exhausted the capability of viewers to watch OTT and Zoom, and Netflix and other videos. We've also seen, of course, as discussed in other presentations, major shift in working hours, 800% growth in Zoom, and doubling of upstream bandwidth. I think the impressive bit is the network is not just the network growth, but the network has been able to sustain this as we've watched really significant build-outs by cloud providers, Zoom and others. We've watched providers across the US and Europe add significant port capacity. So it really is, I think, testament to the dedication of the industry and the response that we have been able to meet this continued demand, in addition to some policy changes. As I said, the big question from service providers are, what are the trends? What's changing the network? What is driving the growth? Will the growth level off? And how particularly are we with respect to the peaks, normally prime time hours around the world, 9 to 11 p.m. or give or take. So I think the good news, as I said, is mostly network has been dealing with it. We have seen really significant growth in most of the video, largely Netflix and YouTube, driving most of the peak growth. And during the business day, really massive growth in both gaming, WhatsApp, Skype, Zoom, and other collaboration tools. The key metric, as I said, and I'll show some slides coming up of it, is not just what is the growth in the network, but how are the applications performing? And indeed, with many of the measurements we have from providers around the world, we've been able to measure QBR, the ABR, the bit streaming rate of the different applications, particularly video, to assess where there's congestion, where there's in fact capacity issues in different parts of the network. So here's kind of a quick look looking at US provider, actually a collection of US providers. Basically, we've removed some of the numbers on the axes, but the curves represent the typical diurnal curves you'd expect in most networks. We have basically the beginning of March before the lockdowns on the left-hand side of the graph. And you can see as we move farther to the right, the impact of the school closures followed by lockdowns. I think the major take-home point from the graph is both 40, 50% growth from normal, and you'll also notice a change in the shape of the graph in that the normal, very steep curve becomes smoother and smoother as we see not just large bandwidth usage during prime time, but also during the working day. This is another graph looking at Europe. This graph is a little bit complicated. There's lots of different lines on it, but I'll spend a minute explaining what you're seeing. We've graphed week over week comparisons for the first week of March, March 8th, March 22nd. The gray line down at the bottom of the graph is showing more or less what normal looked like through the course of a week at the beginning of March. Green line, the green horizontal line, providing sort of a baseline sort of average of where the Saturday or Sunday evening peaks used to hit. Back on March 10th, the networks in Europe thought we had reached what would have been the high for the year, which was Call of Duty, the big upgrade. And we thought that would be the peak for the year. Somewhat to everyone's surprise, a week later, of course, with the lockdowns, and we hit the yellow graph, we start to see the really significant and systemic growth in traffic that's continued on in the red graph as well. So as you can see, the growth has been significant. We had a number of concerns about would this growth continue? Would it be 40% week after week? As I said, there indeed does appear to be a limit to the amount of primarily HD and SD video that people can watch Saturday and Sunday night. As I said on the other graph, you'll also notice the graphs become a lot more wide. This is just kind of looking at a little bit of the weekday traffic. And you'll note that during the weekday, we've seen really the most significant growth really at the start of the day. So typically, most internet traffic in consumer networks in the US, driven by HD video, was during the weekends or in the evenings. Now we're seeing 80% growth, certainly starting at sort of 9 a.m. local time in both Europe and the US, and overall seeing weekday traffic up between 50 and 70%. So really, really significant changes. I also found this really interesting. In addition to just monitoring the traffic, we study how structurally is traffic provided. As many on this, many attendees will know, Netflix and other large video typically are using on-net CDN, racks and racks of servers that are near or actually on-premise in different carrier networks. Typically with Netflix, we see pretty high cache rates. I think what has been interesting is watching as we've hit, in some cases, cache capacity, and this may be more of an issue for countries like Australia. We've seen traffic shift from the on-net caches to more significant Netflix volumes begin to use peering and international peering. This may be an artifact both of capacity to local caches as well as cache locality and the sort of, the largely increased numbers of viewers over a much larger catalog. but really some interesting changes to not just the volume of traffic, but how that traffic is being delivered in the networks. The next two graphs are the ones that I find both, I think, the most reassuring and the most significant. With traffic growing 40, 50% in some networks in Europe, 60%, the obvious question is the network performance? One of the things we look at is video quality, particularly what are the streaming rates for the major OTT providers, what are the streaming rates for the major video conferencing applications. And I think the really good news is that largely the streaming rates have remained unchanged, which indicates there is not widespread capacity or congestion in the network. What you're looking at here is both YouTube in blue, Netflix in orange. We're looking at the per subscriber stream rate averaged over tens of millions or maybe hundreds of millions of subscribers in Europe, in the US. So for each subscriber, we're tracking the application and then the stream rate over the life of the multiple video sessions. You'll notice that Netflix really began the month at, give or take 4.2, 4.3 megabits per second, which is typically what we'd expect to see, and sustain that until Netflix announced that in parts of Europe, they were starting to make policy changes to reduce the streaming rate. You'll notice at the same time, we do not see the same change for YouTube. Again, this is representing a cross-section of European providers. Somewhat on the other side of the coin, looking at US providers, we again are looking at a combination of US providers, several million, tens of millions of subscribers in the US, pretty broad cross-section, including many of the states on lockdown. You'll again notice that the Netflix streaming rate remains 2 megabits or so going through. And you'll notice a policy change where the YouTube streaming rate drops near the end of March. So we've taken a look at the major OTT rates and been able to show that the network in both Europe and the US and Asia has largely been able to maintain QoE while seeing a 40, 50, 60% growth. The other really interesting growth, of course, has been during the business day. During the business day, you'll notice that there has been an explosive growth in all video conferencing apps. That's things like WebEx, Skype, and Zoom. But the real interesting driver here is Zoom. While all went up, Zoom popularity by far is dominant, going up in some cases 800% in some networks during the business day. So the clear winner, both in terms of number of eyeballs and certainly the amount of bandwidth. It's also interesting watching how Zoom was able to achieve this growth. At the beginning of March, basically all Zoom traffic went through Zoom-hosted servers in Zoom's own autonomous system, their own sort of infrastructure. You'll notice as we get to the lockdown, Zoom began to rapidly move traffic into AWS in the Amazon cloud. So I think, again, the real testament to the network is both the built-in capacity, both the shifting of traffic from peering to CDN has provided really significant ability to grow in situations like this. And certainly the third component is things like the cloud, whether it be Azure or EC2, providing on-demand capacity for rapidly expanding now mission-critical services like Zoom. I'll just finish off with, I think, just one more slide. In addition to download going up significantly, in some cases, 40, 50% in the US, it's also the upstream bandwidth. Again, as many attendees may recognize that with DOCSIS, there's typically significant asymmetry between the up and the down load. So we've been closely watching the capacity of the average subscriber as video conferencing becomes more and more prevalent, as well as it turns out, interestingly enough, YouTube video uploads have gone up massively over the last 2-3 weeks. In general, we're seeing, give or take, an average of about 30% increase. Again, this is looking at a cross-section of US and European providers, taking somewhat of an average, looking at the upstream bandwidth. This is coming up from subscribers, and roughly seeing about 30% growth since the beginning of March. We're still spending some time now trying to understand if we can find measures of the performance in the QoE and indicators, again, of congestion or capacity issues on the upstream bandwidth. I'll end with a final slide, just sort of summarizing what we've been finding as we look at a fairly large cross-section of providers around the world. As I've said multiple times, the internet has seen certainly become significantly increase in the traffic, but also the criticality. My son is now attending school. All my meetings are now online. My wife's work is online. So it's both time where the traffic volumes have grown and the criticality has grown. Largely the good news is we're largely meeting the demand from most of the providers we look at in both the bandwidth and the QoE. As I've said in the last couple slides, that I think that this probably wouldn't have been such a, I don't want to say smooth, but I think this would have been far more challenging 5 years ago or before we had some of these significant changes in network architecture, capacity, and certainly cloud. The pre-pandemic, Netflix largely prepared many of the networks for just a massive growth on Sunday, Saturday evenings, where we've had to build that capacity into the network and prepare for that growth through the course of a year, in addition to the CDN and the peering. I think as we've worked with providers, we have seen over the last 2-3 weeks a rapid acceleration of network buildouts. This is largely turning up what previously had been unallocated ports in Equinix and other exchanges. We've seen much more dense peering, including folks like Telefónica and others open for the next N number of months, settlement-free peering. I think many of these changes, both in the type of applications used, the societal use of the internet, and certainly some of the infrastructure changes we're seeing in the internet will likely be permanent. With that, I think I'm mostly at time and appreciate the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Can you hang around? Because I've got a question or two for you.
Absolutely.
First of all, thank you very much for those fascinating insights into what's happening around the world. I have a question from Dave in New York, who must be up very late watching this. So cheerio to you, Dave. Dave asks, there's very little data coming out of Africa and other places that don't have landlines and are reliant almost totally on mobile networks. What are they seeing there right now?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So let me just say first, we haven't looked at that specifically. We do have some deployments in the Middle East, not in Africa specifically, though we do work with some of the world's largest transit providers. So we'll largely see all the Trans-Pacific, Trans-Asia, transatlantic traffic. So the short answer is I don't have very good numbers on it. It has been both in our data and others reported, I think it's been interesting that mobile traffic in many cases is down as more and more people are at home. But I think it's a great question. I don't have specific data on Africa.
Okay, and a second question also from Dave. He asks, or he says, the current trend is pretty clear that things are under control in terms of network demand. But do you see if there is any, say, escalation in the COVID-19 crisis, maybe a lot more dead or a lot more of a pervasive lockdown, do you see any significant changes occurring perhaps in the next 60 to 90 days?
Yeah, as I said, I think the thing we were most concerned about was Saturday and Sunday nights and the peaks. Do those peaks grow week after week, 40% or more? Mm-hmm. And I actually was surprised the peaks grew at all. I actually had thought we had reached peak Netflix already. These peaks are largely driven by HD video, right? It takes a lot of Twitter, a lot of Facebook, a lot of Zoom to even approximate the bandwidth used by 30 million, 100 million subs all watching their own personalized HD video stream. So, the concern was, how do we reach peak video? It surprised me to see 2 weeks in a row, and like in the UK, where indeed we had grown 30% 2 weeks in a row, and would it stop? That would have been a real significant problem because we were at capacity. Largely, we seem to have reached the peak video. I think the more interesting questions now will be more around particularly subscriber upstream, and as we do more distance learning and others, what are the capacity issues and what are the QoE issues, particularly around that. The only other thing I think that has been of concern is we also do security monitoring and DDoS. Largely, things like DDoS tend to take a dip, distributed denial of service, attacks against the infrastructure. During Christmas, for example, DDoS drops, and at least initially, it looked like we had seen a drop in the amount of global DDoS. That grace period seems to have ended, and we're now seeing an increase in the sort of volume and number of attacks that we're seeing. So I think that would be the only other area of concern as the internet becomes more critical, seeing an uptick in the abuse of the network.
Okay, and I've got a final question that was just texted to me from Ian from Melbourne. His question is, what is your best estimate of likely demand post-COVID compared with pre-COVID? I think what he means by that is, will things go back to normal, or has behavior been changed permanently as a result of this?
Well, I think there's two aspects to that. One of them that I can study is the architectural, the infrastructure changes. As we look at peering sessions where two providers interconnect with each other, I expect a lot of this infrastructure is permanent. Once someone peers, it generally doesn't go away, barring business disputes. I think the ports we've seen added. I think the new sort of exchange points and different. So from an infrastructure point of view, I expect some of these changes have accelerated trends over the last 10 years of how the internet's been evolving. I think that's permanent. I think whether societally we go back to whether, is the next CommsDay, did everyone decide this was such a great vehicle? Do we have the next CommsDay also be virtual? I do think people like to interact in person. So I do think we will see, I'm itching to get back into the office. So I do think some of that will change, but I'm not a sociologist. So I can comment on the infrastructure. That I think is permanent. The societal changes will be interesting to watch as